the most recent bushfire crisis burnt out 7.5 million hectares of temperate forests and released 830 million tonnes of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Now, that's a figure, and this is what struck me so much, almost double our nation's annual emissions from energy, industry, transport combined. These fires were a natural disaster. However, it was a disaster that could have been mitigated if fuel loads were reduced. My next guests are campaigning for clearer and more efficient legislation to reduce fuel loads in bushfire-prone regions. Mr Colin Boyce, LNP member for Queensland Parliament, joins me now. He's coming to me from Queensland there, of course, and federal member for Hughes, Liberal MP Craig Kelly in Sydney. I'll start with you, Craig, on some of those macro numbers. It would shock people to know that the bushfires, which don't count in terms of emissions for Paris targets, were twice as bad for the environment as all the other baddies, energy, industry and transport, as I said there. And of course, if you want to do bushfire mitigation with hazard reduction burns, you have to count those for the Paris Agreement.
Firstly, Peter, when you say they are baddies, remember we're talking about carbon dioxide, that clear gas that we put in our still water to turn it into sparkling mineral water. That's what we're talking about as bad. And you were right, the bushfires emitted twice as much CO2 as we did from all those other sources this year. But under the Paris Agreement and the previous Kyoto Agreement, those are considered natural and they simply don't count in a nation's tally. Now, that's fair enough that they don't count, but the problem is, Peter, if a farmer clears his land and clears a fire break on his land and he actually diminishes the amount of bushfires that we have or diminishes the amount of land that would be burnt or lost in a bushfire, that sort of hazard reduction treatment actually counts and is added in to our Paris totals. So some of these things that we were doing, Peter, post-COVID-19 simply didn't make sense back then. They harmed our farming communities. And if we're going to go forward as a nation post-COVID-19, we've got to make sure that we can let farmers farm, we can let miners mine, we can let workers work, and we can get rid of all these ridiculous regulations and restrictions that are stopping our nation from being as productive as it otherwise would.
Colin, some of the toughest land management laws in the country are in Queensland, put in place by the Labor government, I would argue, to cut a deal for green preferences in the city of Brisbane, in and around the suburbs too. There's a big debate going on that out of this coronavirus crisis, we're going to have to reform our economy to get back on our feet. There'll be a massive, multi-billion-dollar, multi-generational debt. Surely this is the time that we're going to see some sense in Queensland and repeal some of these draconian laws.
Absolutely, Peter. I couldn't agree with you more. And we have these terribly restrictive vegetation management laws here in Queensland. As Craig has said, 800 million tonnes plus of CO2 into the atmosphere, twice Australia's emission levels. If you're a farmer at Charleville and you're trying to feed your starving cattle mulga, which regenerates itself the same as the forest does, which is going to sequester all of the carbon dioxide that was pumped into the atmosphere, this is an absolute staggering piece of hypocrisy from the environmental argument. And these things need to change in Queensland.
Craig, it's interesting, mulga, Colin's absolutely right, regenerates. It should be something that we see as a resource. What involvement has the federal government? Has it got any way in which it can unwind some of these laws? Because Scott Morrison's talked very much about how important it is to get agriculture to lead the recovery.
Look, they are state government laws and they do vary from state to state, but the problem that we've got at the moment is there's these farmers in Queensland, in the middle of a drought, they've got the mulga trees growing on their properties. Their trees on their property, like for the last century, they've been able to knock them down as a last resort feed for the cattle in times of drought. Now, if they do that, and those mulga trees, when the rains come again, as they always do, those mulga trees regenerate and regrow. So you've got a cycle. But at the moment, these guys are being fined, there's a case of someone being fined $1 million in Queensland for knocking down trees on his own property And this is all done under the guise that we are lowering our emissions. So we've got to make some really firm statements out of Canberra that, you know, whatever legislation we had in the past, the appeasement of the Greens, that's got to go. We can't do that post-COVID-19. We've got to make sure that we are doing everything in our country to make sure our farmers can be as productive as they can be and not tying their hands with all this red and green tape that we've seen both, unfortunately, from Canberra and also from the States.
Colin, one of the big issues that we all, I think, learnt probably for the first time out of the bushfire crisis was the extent to which our forests, state forests, have become locked up. A lot of the fire trails are not maintained, very difficult for fire crews to get in and even attempt to fight the fires. Many of them just couldn't gain access, and by then the fires were too great. It used to be that farmers could graze cattle in a lot of this country, and it obviously helped reduce the fuel load. That's very difficult to do. Is that some area that needs reform as well?
Oh, without a doubt, Peter. And traditionally, graziers have used national parks and state forests to graze their cattle, and this is a way to keep the fuel loads down in the forests. The past 20 years with the environmental argument to lock these forests up, remove the ability for everybody to manage the forest and to do controlled burning and to manage the fuel loads, has added to these horrific fires that we've just experienced, which just absolutely destroyed our environment. And whilst they will stand on the moral high ground and virtue signal and say that they're looking after the environment, what they're actually doing is destroying. So we need to have some another look at and a rethink on how we manage all of our state forests, our crown lands and so forth.
Craig, I want to finish with you if I can. You pointed me to a study in relation to the Italian area of Lombardy where there's been such a high rate of deaths from coronavirus. And some activists, I have to call them that, are out there saying that one of the reasons why is because of the emissions, the air pollution in that area has affected the lungs of these people. They were more likely to die, they say, out of that region than in other regions. And it says, doesn't it then, to the climate change activist, well, we've got to really get our emissions down because you get a virus like this and high emissions, climate change only make it worse. But that's not the case, is it?
Well, Peter, you've got to make sure that when you're talking about emissions, you're distinguishing between carbon dioxide, again, that clear, odourless gas, and actually particulate emissions, which is the smoke and soot that gets piled into the atmosphere. Now, what we've seen in that northern Italian region is a very high concentrations of particulate matter air pollution. That's all the dust and soot in the atmosphere. But when you look at the studies, that pollution is not coming from fossil fuels. It's coming from burning wood. The majority of the particulate pollution, air pollution in northern Italy comes from burning wood. And this is the thing. Under these crazy Paris agreements that we have, burning wood, they call it biomass, is considered as renewable energy. So these perverse policies that we have are actually encouraging the burning of wood, where you would get much less particulate matter if you're using fossil fuels or even better, nuclear power. You'd get a reduction in actual air pollution from burning wood. But the perversion is, under Paris, it's the other way. It's encouraging burning wood, which is making the environment worse. And as we've seen, that's a suspected reason why there's been so many more deaths from COVID-19 in northern Italy as there has in other parts of the world.
I tell you what, it's always the devil in the detail with this stuff. Colin Boyce, Craig Kelly, thank you very much for your time tonight.